Without equity policy protections, this neighborhood alone has seen the loss of over 2,000 units of low-income housing and a substantial loss of the Black resident population. Our neighborhood is not a rarity, as the city's growth at any cost approach to development has led to Cincinnati being one of the most segregated cities in our country, with over half of our children living in poverty and 28,000 households struggling to find housing they can afford for their families. A profound crisis exists in our city, and we have no time to waste passing any legislation that maintains what has become the status quo of wreaking havoc on our Black communities, communities of color, and neighbors of low income. Councilmember Landsman's balanced development legislation does not focus on or prioritize what we know are our city's greatest public needs: decent, affordable housing and living wage jobs for Cincinnatians at the bottom of the economic ladder. The legislation, as it is currently written, lacks substantial ways to address and prioritize the harms that the racism and classism of the development industry has inflicted on people of color and working class people in our city. It is painfully obvious that the private market discriminates, which is why it should be equally obvious that our public leverage should be used to offset this behavior.
We like development. It can be done in a way that lifts up our priorities and the priorities of our neighbors, like affordable housing and engaging community members during the project planning process. Right now, though, the way developers get city support for their projects doesn't reflect these priorities. We know that there are members of City Council who support affordable housing and greater community input throughout the development process. However, while Councilmember Landsman's current balanced development legislation may name the priorities of affordable housing and community input, it doesn't add anything in the way of holding developers accountable to these priorities. Instead of passing this piece of legislation, we need City Council to continue working towards specific, actionable plan items of how developers will be held to higher standards in our communities.
City, you told us that our immigrant families were relevant when you made this a sanctuary city. But yet so many folks on the west side are getting displaced. So that's a symbolic gesture with no meaning behind it whatsoever. You painted Black Lives Matter in front of City Hall, yet I have still yet to see that my Black Lives Matters when there are folks that are still experiencing homelessness, when 75% of the folks that are on the streets are Black and dying. We need to address these issues with some meaningful policies. We don't want surface level things. These are life and death.
If you look at these other cities that have been mentioned, Portland, Oregon, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Charlotte, North Carolina, they have very specific requirements for doing things in return for what you get.
In 2017, so almost 4 years ago now, members of the Community Act Now Coalition and the Paisley Neighborhood Center met with Just Bay Cincy. They met with us and with our labor union partners. They sought meaningful input from working people on how to do development differently. These suggestions were incorporated and are now part of the equitable development rubric. That's why it's so strong. Unlike the rubric, the Landsman proposal is an empty shell. It demonstrates a complete lack of engagement with working people and their unions. His proposal sends a message to developers that as long as nobody looks too closely, they will not even be held to a minimum standard required by law. It fosters the existing culture of corruption, encourages a race to the bottom mentality, and it won't lead to good wages, stronger enforcement of prevailing wages, or an expansion of living wages for working people in our city.
Community councils and residents in neighborhoods across the city are in this work for the long term because this is where we live. We live in the city, and working class people in communities of color will not go away. We will continue to work because we know that we are a part of that solution, and it is sorely lacking at City Council.